one thing that I've learned from working as a yoga teacher for almost 20 years is that all this like wellness, yoga, well-being, it is a very individual thing. That's why in actual yoga practice, there's a whole thing about self-study. Yoga is a very personal practice. I remember like early on when I was doing a lot more training and doing donation classes. And I guess this could connect to things like imposter syndrome, but I remember thinking like back in the Disney, like all of these great texts and books that we'd have to read in training and thinking, well, they didn't have TTCs. They didn't have like these institutional organizational bodies that, the standardization of the yoga practice. These were just people who went within, moved around, and got to know their body, right? And how the body works in this reality. And, at this stage of my career, teaching yoga internationally at award-winning retreats, not my personal retreat, but being like a resident teacher at a fantastic wellness retreat, was that it just like, it has to make sense, as in you can say all the Sanskrit words, you can memorize all the poses, but if you're not like paying attention, it's just a pattern like anything else. And embodiment comes through like lived experience, right? And hence where you can do all the qualifications and you can do all the training, you can tick all the boxes, but it's the practice in earnest. It's paying attention to yourself. It's feeling your body as you're moving it. And one of my teachers at one point, like, they talked about wellness or well-being being like imbalance. We do balancing postures, but overall in your life, how to stay in balance. And again, how else do we learn that other than living our lives as authentically as we can and being knocked off center to then come back again? And so back in like, even as early as 2017, I took a huge leap in my business, entrepreneurialism. I published a book. I went through incredible financial instability and eventual collapse. And I kept practicing my yoga. I kept posting online. I was quite fiercely like determined to keep going. And then 2020 happened. And eventually realizing I was really burnt out and like not really like knowing what this burnout was all about. And I've been living on my own, sustaining things, teaching my clients online, doing my tarot readings, going through some pretty major familial upheaval, which I probably will share and talk about healing the mother wound. I had a huge psychological breakthrough last year around the dynamic with my own mother and being, I suppose you call it, parentified and enmeshed. And then more recently going through almost like a reverb of the mother wound via a sort of professional business alliance / friendship. But the mother wound for me is exhibited through, it's subtle until it's not so subtle, until you can really see it clearly, but sort of denying ourselves to prioritize someone else. And I'm really intrigued to observe and witness the unfolding at this point on the other side of a deeper recognition of my own mother wounding, mother, father, early upbringing, right? The way we're kind of traumatized and indoctrinated to operate a certain way for our survival, and how that exhibits itself in our adult lives, like even being a yoga teacher and with All to Love the brand, my desire to make the world a better place and kind of save the world or save people, and how on the other side of healing the mother wound, being like, oh my God, you know, a lot of that comes from the wounding, wanting to save my mother, wanting to make her happy, right? And how that can end up entangling us with, you know, just people wanting our attention, people, wanting our time, our energy, our attention, and how through enmeshment, you, as a child, you really do feel the wounding underneath all the masks, right? So you're actually operating really from the shadow, unconsciously, to try to heal, to try to make them heal and feel better, and etc., until you can't, until you wake up to the realization that they're their own human, and as everyone is, and nothing you say or do, etc., is actually gonna like inherently resolve it, other than coming back to self, right? And this is where it's like a sticky kind of you know, it requires courage, it requires a certain amount of boldness to then shift into truly prioritizing yourself. And this is where a lot of the therapists and people going through it will talk about grieving a life that was never real, grieving a parent that never truly existed. And then what I'm experiencing is actually like grieving connections, relationships that I'm like, I'm not even sure are real, or if they're just a kind of mirage, symbolic reflection of that mother wound. And then the boldness and the courage to move forward in my own authenticity, which can feel like almost icky and uncomfortable after 43 years or for however long of like denying yourself. And it's multi-layered and it's subtle, right? That's why like just paying attention, and I would dare see why so many of us are inclined to be sharing our stories and sharing ourselves on the internet, but recognize we're sharing on the internet, but we're actually like reflecting things to ourselves, because we're all just actually like sharing on our little phones here and then putting it out into the cosmic airwaves. And, you know, increasingly, and again, when I started practicing yoga, it was like partying and pursuing an acting career. Like I wasn't cut out for that industry, and freelancing and, you know, trying to make my way in the world in my mid-20s. Yoga was a really earnest and like a knowing for me. And at the time, people were like, what's yoga? Is it a cult? Like, I don't know. And like straight up, the entire mainstream patriarchal indoctrination, pharmaceutical education, like really, these are all cults. These are all programmed thinking, ideological structures that we're indoctrinated into, and we're all just meant to be good little worker bees, right? Or good little leaders for this and these empires. Which is why at this stage in my life, like taking risks and being guided in earnest through spiritual connection and spiritual practices, like is quite radical. And to come to this point where like nervous system is more healed, it's all like able to hold space for triggers and emotional storms, and continuing to see the profundity and depth of a practice like yoga. It never ends. Anyway, my time is running out. Getting ready. Got a session. 40 minutes.